Is it possible that one of the most game-changing athletes in recent memory is being systematically overlooked by one of the biggest sports networks in the world? Right now, a firestorm is brewing around ESPN's recent omission of Caitlin Clark from its list of all-time greatest women's college basketball players. For anyone who's followed Clark's meteoric rise, it feels like a blatant act of rewriting history. How does someone who single-handedly boosted ratings, broke record after record, and energized millions of new fans end up entirely left out of the conversation? It's not just about hurt feelings or a single snub. It's about consistent, calculated moves that diminish her influence and focus on everyone but Clark, even though her on-court dominance is undeniable. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain to expose the twisted logic ESPN is using to exclude Clark from the top ranks of women's basketball. Few players have exploded onto the college basketball scene the way Caitlin Clark did. Before her, Iowa wasn't exactly a powerhouse program capturing headlines every season. Sure, they had a solid foundation and passionate fans, but the national media spotlight often skipped right over them in favor of more established dynasties like UConn, Tennessee, or Stanford. Then came Clark, a dynamic point guard with a shooter's touch rarely seen at any level of the game. From her very first tip-off at Iowa, Clark unleashed a brand of basketball that was equal parts electric and relentless. She wasn't just banking in threes, she was draining them from logos, launching shots from distances that forced defenders to guard her the moment she crossed half-court. But she wasn't content just scoring in eye-popping fashion. Clark also showcased impeccable court vision, threading pinpoint passes through traffic and racking up assists at a rate that left commentators and opponents in awe. She became the engine that powered her team's offense, a floor general who made everyone around her better. Suddenly, the Iowa Hawkeyes found themselves in the national conversation, not because they'd stacked their roster with a parade of top recruits, but because a single generational talent was elevating them to new heights. It was both mesmerizing and unprecedented. In just a few seasons, Clark carried Iowa to back-to-back national championship games, a feat few analysts ever expected from a program that lacked the recruiting muscle of bigger schools. Yet it wasn't just Iowa fans taking notice. Television ratings soared when Clark played, and social media lit up with clips of her fearless brand of basketball. Young players across the country saw her confidence and realized they, too, could push the boundaries of what women's basketball traditionally looked like. She brought renewed energy to a sport that had often struggled to attract mainstream media coverage, and she did it with a fearless style reminiscent of the greatest offensive wizards in men's basketball. If stats alone define greatness, Clark's seat at the table of college basketball legends would have been reserved long ago. But as we'll see, ESPN somehow decided her achievements still weren't enough. By the time she shattered scoring records, not just for her team or her conference, but across the entire NCAA landscape, Clark was no longer just a rising star. She was the face of women's college hoops. Analysts who'd once predicted her success might stall at the next level suddenly realized she was unstoppable. Her leadership, her swagger, and her ability to turn a modestly regarded program into a legitimate contender forced everyone to pay attention. And it was all done without the typical formula of join a stacked team and ride a wave of talent. Clark was forging her own path, rewriting the script that said only super teams win. But as the hype around her continued to grow, it also spotlighted the inconsistency that ESPN would soon demonstrate in acknowledging her place among the greats. In the next section, we'll examine how the network abruptly shifted gears to discredit her, using a standard they simply never applied to countless male athletes who share the same so-called shortcoming, not winning a college championship. Any honest sports historian will tell you that a college championship, while impressive, is hardly the be-all and end-all for a player's legacy. Some of the most celebrated figures in college basketball, Larry Bird, Oscar Robertson, Pete Maravich, never won that final trophy. Yet ESPN routinely places them among the pantheon of legends, and rightly so. Their collective impact on the sport transcended the simple matter of capturing a single banner. They set records, dazzled fans, and propelled college basketball into the mainstream, cementing themselves as icons without the need for that one crowning achievement. So why does ESPN suddenly pivot to the no championship, no recognition argument when it comes to Caitlin Clark? If consistency were a core principle, you'd expect to see Bird, Maravich, and Robertson similarly excluded from their all-time lists. But that's not what's happening. Instead, ESPN gave them well-deserved praise while shrugging off their lack of titles, chalking it up to the brilliance of their play and how they revolutionized the game. When Clark does the same, arguably on an even more extreme scale, given the wave of attention she's brought to women's basketball, she's written off. They pat her on the back for her scoring prowess, and then swiftly remove her from the ultimate conversation of greatest ever. It's this double standard that has fans fuming, and rightly so. People aren't upset that legendary champions like Breanna Stewart, Cheryl Miller, or Maya Moore are on ESPN's list. They absolutely deserve to be. The outrage stems from ESPN's refusal to apply the same logic to Clark as it does to male players who lacked rings and still received top billing. Caitlin Clark not only transformed her team's fortunes, she revolutionized an entire segment of the sport. Most networks would consider that a bulletproof case for historical recognition. ESPN, however, pivoted to the single argument of she didn't close the deal with a national championship, even though she appeared in 2 consecutive title games. This cherry-picking approach is more than just inconsistent, it's flat-out manipulative. ESPN has effectively moved the goalposts for Clark, ignoring her role in boosting television ratings to historic levels and rewriting record books across categories like points, assists, and general offensive efficiency. The question becomes, why? Why would a network typically devoted to celebrating standout individual accomplishments suddenly decide that only one stat, championship rings, matters? Could it be because acknowledging Clark's place at the top would contradict the established narratives and star images they've spent years building up? Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe they just never expected someone like Clark, at a program like Iowa, to reach the pinnacle so quickly. No matter the motive, the contradiction is jarring. But that wasn't the whole story. It's not merely that they're ignoring her on a list. There's an added layer to this. ESPN cleverly leverages Clark's name and image to attract viewers, only to undermine her status when it comes time for official accolades. Let's dive deeper into how that tactic plays out in practice. Anyone who tuned into certain ESPN segments saw Caitlin Clark's face used prominently in advertisements and promotional materials. It's no secret that her name draws clicks. She has become the single biggest needle mover in women's basketball, generating more hype than practically anyone else in the game right now. ESPN knows this. They aren't oblivious. They capitalize on her popularity, splashing her image everywhere to bump up ratings and drive conversation. And for a while, fans were thrilled that Clark was finally getting the attention she deserved, until the moment they realized how ESPN was actually using her. The issue became glaring when Clark's image was plastered across teasers for discussions about the greatest players in women's college basketball history. You'd see headlines shouting, "Is Caitlin Clark the best ever?" Or "Has women's basketball found its new superstar?" But once the show kicked off, the narrative would abruptly pivot. Commentators would tease the idea of Clark's greatness, only to drop a definitive statement like, "But she's just not in the top 5. Viewers who tuned in to see Clark lauded for her achievements found themselves watching a snub unfold in real time. It was more than just a case of ESPN deciding to rank her lower. It felt like a bait-and-switch, a cold, calculated tactic to draw in the largest possible audience and then discard the very player they'd used as a promotional hook. For fans invested in Clark's journey, this wasn't just disappointing. It felt like a betrayal. They weren't angry because the network engaged in healthy debate about where Clark stands historically. Debate is part of sports culture. They were angry at the underlying hypocrisy. Use the star to boost your views, then systematically exclude her once you have the audience. It's an approach that leaves a bad taste, especially when you consider Clark's undeniable role in revitalizing interest in women's hoops. Some observers argue that this might just be a case of ESPN stirring the pot for controversy, creating drama to keep discussions lively. But there's a fine line between stirring the pot and orchestrating a blatant marketing ploy. If ESPN genuinely believed Clark belonged outside the top 5, they could have stated it plainly without turning her name into clickbait. The repeated cycle of hyping her up, then tossing her aside, suggests it's less about legitimate analysis and more about maximizing short-term ratings. But that wasn't the whole story either. More than just a tactic for clicks, ESPN's snub overshadows the real reason so many fans fell in love with Clark's style of play in the first place. She wasn't just a gifted scorer. She transformed the women's game in ways that no one else had done so quickly or so dramatically. Let's get into how her presence fundamentally shifted the landscape of women's basketball, a shift ESPN conveniently glosses over when it focuses solely on championships. Before Caitlin Clark burst onto the scene, women's college basketball often struggled to capture mainstream attention beyond established powerhouse programs. Traditional rivalries like UConn-Tennessee were big, but the average fan might not turn on a regular season women's game unless it was a marquee matchup. Ratings languished in comparison to men's sports, and coverage remained minimal outside of the NCAA tournament. Then Clark arrived, and everything changed seemingly overnight. Her fearless shooting, unyielding energy, and highlight reel assists spark a renewed fascination with the women's game, even among fans who previously only watched men's basketball. Suddenly, social media feeds were flooded with clips of Clark pulling up from the logo, or zipping a pass between 3 defenders. People who had never followed women's basketball found themselves tuning in to see if she would drop 40 points, snag a triple-double, or break some new record. Iowa's games started drawing in national audiences at levels rarely seen before. The conversation around who's the best in the country shifted to "you gotta see Caitlin Clark." The beauty of it was that Clark's presence didn't just elevate her own status, it lifted the entire sport. Attendance soared for Iowa road games because rival fans wanted to witness her jaw-dropping performances in person. Her matchups became must-see events, contributing to record-breaking television contracts and a spike in merchandise sales. So, in a sense, Clark was single-handedly fueling the growth of women's basketball's economic ecosystem. Sponsors and advertisers began paying more attention, realizing the potential for a new wave of devoted fans. Even ESPN's own analysts occasionally slipped up and acknowledged that Clark had done more to popularize the women's game than any player in recent memory. Yet somehow, those same analysts turned right around and supported her exclusion from top 5 status based on that lone missing championship ring. It's a glaring contradiction. If ESPN truly values the growth of the sport and the cultural impact a player has, Clark's name should be front and center as one of the greatest. You can't tout her for breaking viewing records one minute and then claim she's ineligible for GOAT debates the next. But that wasn't the full story either. If it were just about championships, you'd see ESPN be consistent across the board. But they aren't. They'll praise certain players without rings and even elevate them to legendary status. Yet for Clark, that door stays locked. This is where the network's double standards become impossible to ignore, as we'll see next. Double standards in sports media aren't new, but the way ESPN has handled Caitlin Clark feels especially egregious. Consider how the network framed players like Angel Reese. When Reese taunted Clark in a high-stakes moment, it was celebrated as an emblem of her competitive fire, the passion we love to see in sports. Yet when Clark showcased her own brand of swagger and intensity, she found herself labeled cocky or overhyped. For an outlet that supposedly champions the rise of women's basketball, ESPN appears inconsistent at best, hypocritical at worst. And it goes beyond just on-court demeanor. Whenever other players break a record or lead a team to victory, the narrative is about grit, perseverance, and how they overcame challenges. When Clark does it, the conversation shifts to, well, she's great, but let's see if she wins the title. Rarely do you see the network dwell on the adversity she faced in carrying a mid-tier program to the final stage. Instead, they focus on the outcome, ignoring the near-impossible journey that got her there in the first place. But that wasn't the whole story either. This pattern of undercutting Clark's achievements points to a much bigger question. Does ESPN have an actual agenda to keep certain legacies intact at the expense of fresh superstars? The next section explores how Clark is poised for an unstoppable future, even if ESPN keeps moving the goalpost to minimize her. For all of ESPN's shifting criteria and attempts to sideline Clark in a historical conversation, the reality on the court is undeniable. Clark continues to rack up points at an alarming pace, piling on assists, rebounds, and intangible leadership qualities that can't be properly measured by box score data. Her run at Iowa was only the beginning. Everyone in the basketball community knows her skill set translates seamlessly to the professional level, and fans are already anticipating how she will reshape the WNBA once she gets there in full force. Some players come into the college game with hype and fade once the competition intensifies, but Clark thrives under pressure. She's proven that time and again, be it in the NCAA tournament, conference matchups, or even exhibition games that draw national attention. If she continues on this trajectory, it's possible she'll obliterate more records than any previous player. And let's not forget her influence extends beyond the stat sheet. When a superstar can single-handedly elevate an entire team and capture the attention of millions, that's an athlete who redefines the way people perceive the sport. Clark has done that, and she's barely out of college. In the end, the biggest lesson from Caitlin Clark's ESPN snub isn't just about one athlete spot on a list. It's about how easily the narrative can be manipulated when a massive platform decides to shift the criteria. For decades, ESPN has celebrated individual brilliance, ring or no ring, as a hallmark of basketball greatness. Yet when faced with a woman who's not just racking up eye-popping numbers but also steering the entire sport into mainstream prominence, they conveniently change the rules. They use her name to draw an audience, then sideline her achievements when it comes time for the final honors. Like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications to stay connected. You won't want to miss what comes next, because as Caitlin Clark continues to break barriers, the world is watching. And so are we.